Eric,
Omar,
you know what I've realized, bro?
what have you realized, my brother?
Several different things. One, that you're a hunk. It's a confirmation. I already knew that, but it wasn't even epiphany. It's always just a top of the mind thing. But second, we have done so much in order to guarantee we have video for our lovely viewers and listeners for another sizzling episode of Iron Culture. But I just remembered, my man, that the viewers, those that watch the video portion and not just listen to the audio, are the proverbial tip of the iceberg. They represent about, actually now, 10% of the total listeners. But we made sure, Eric, because they, the big capital T, they wanted to stop us. Most people don't know this, and I want you to explain it for everyone out there, that the pandemic, Michel Foucault, he talks about this, like you look at sociology, anthropology, it doesn't really matter, that one must go to the people that recorded their lives in order to find the truth. You can't find the person at the top that is a mouthpiece for the governments, the corporations, whatever the propaganda arm is. You have to listen to the people. And if you listen to the two atop of the pyramid, ruling atop jointly, you will know that the pandemic basically was started as a counteractive measure to try and prevent Eric and myself from ascending to the tippity top. And now, Eric, what they don't know, and this will be entirely irrelevant in a day, a week, a year, a century from now, but the impact will not, is that nationwide in Canada, allegedly, there has been a crashing of the largest internet and television provider, Rogers, today, which is July the 8th, that's affecting millions and millions of Canadians. Someone knew that we were going to record our podcast today, and they said surely that would stop them. If the telephone lines are down, if they have no internet, how could these hunks put out their information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they couldn't do it with COVID. And you shouldn't be surprised. They were literally willing to kill millions to stop us. Failed. And now they're willing to leave people in a true existential crisis. Tens of millions now, not having access to Wi-Fi for 24 hours, which we all know essentially makes Canada not even a third world, but a fourth world country. As far as the human experience is in 2022, not having Wi-Fi for a day. I just hope that suicide rates don't spike so high that it actually collapses all of the country. So best of luck to you. But nonetheless, they couldn't prevent us from our online union of minds. And I mean, the question might be, how are you doing this? What kind of technological wizardry is this? And people, let me tell you that Omar and I have many talents. We are using screen recording software at the same time as using local audio software, at the same time as talking on FaceTime. Because guess what Rogers didn't consider? They didn't consider the excellent coverage plan of iPhones and the ability to FaceTime one another via vast distances. And so, Sir Skype, still got mad respect for you. But we might have to be talking to our buddy FaceTime over here. I'm going to start wearing a black turtleneck and being rude to people, just in honor of the soul of Mac, because they're hooking us up right now, and the cult is coming through, unstoppable as always.
Eric, brilliant as ever. I the one potential grievance we might have with a Mac or Apple sponsorship would be how, they would be adamant that Steve in his youth, he named the company Apple. He was a big fan of apples in general, that he went on the Apple diet. They might try and have us promote that, but surely this podcast won't devolve into something like Macrofactor app, the podcast. I think that's what they currently call it. They certainly won't have us change our names. So like, you wouldn't be like Steve Jobs 1 and I'd be Steve Jobs 2, or I would be like, Granny Smith Apple and you'd be like Golden Apple or Golden Smith Apple or something like that. We would like, I'm assuming that the corporate overlords, as long as you play by their rules, theoretically, they would be benevolent in quotations. Once again, as long as you follow the rigid rules and you don't act out of line.
Yeah, I would be okay with some kind of compromise, like maybe we call it Apple culture, but we retain our own names. I would be good with that.
Yeah.
And
at least one of our names.
So long. Yeah, and you know what? We can Rochambeau to figure out who gets to be named like I Omar or something. I don't know. Yeah, I Omar 11. You're at least an 11, by the way, out of 10. So something like that. I don't know, but I'm willing to compromise given the wasteland that your country has become. I know we're going to have to make some compromises.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm willing. And so long as we keep like a 1-to-1 ratio of content versus ads, our average run time for our episodes, 70, 80 minutes. I don't think 40 minutes of ads is too much, considering we have a lot of overlap with the Macrofactor app podcast.
Yeah.
I think that's probably still less promotion than Greg and Eric do. So.
Yeah, what was it? Pareto's principle, I think they completely bastardized, where they heard 80-20 and they thought in a marketing sense, 80% ads, 20%, and they don't call it content anymore. It's just other stuff. But anyways, I do find that, Eric, interesting. I do want to say also, and I want to say this emphatically, because yes, I throw around the term monster episode. I throw around that phrase, but this is truly one of them. Before we do that, and this is my arrogance, now that we in fact have timestamps, at the least on YouTube, I know if one wants to skip the banters, they could. So we could go all in for 5 to 10 minutes before we go into the topic of getting yuckety-yucked and maybe the consequences therein. Eric, we've had 3 episodes. I have to say, my dude, that the cult has been delivering. When we've given that bat signal and said, hey, we read your comments and we start reading them, we're getting more and more. And I have to say, and of course, there's a heavy bias here because we are the cult. I am loving them. Like, I'm going to read you a few of them, but just I want your reaction after I read all of them. If these are our people, if they're picking up what we're throwing down.
So you want a Helms reacts video to
Yes.
Iron Culture comments. Okay, done.
Yes.
Done.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
I'm ready to produce content. I'm ready to be an influencer. Let's go.
So I actually will ask you, and this one, okay. So we'll start with this. I'll say a few of them. So Jeffrey, who has a great channel, he said it's episode 178, the return of the varicose seals. The bag of worms.
That's good. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. See, that's first off. Thank you, Jeffrey. Is that Jeffrey with a G?
Yes.
Yep. I know who we're talking about. My man with the good content himself, Jeffrey with the G, the OG. Yeah. And by the way, I was mentioning the overlap. You know what other podcast he also comments on? The Macrofactor app podcast. So this is true. No, I get it. I get it. Like we don't want to have a monopoly. We already have enough problems from them. I don't mean, our duopoly that we're sharing with Stronger by Science. I mean, they who try to shut us down. They who have, desecrated the Canadian land of now a non-internet having culture, which I don't even know if that's possible. Can you have a culture without internet? Don't know. I'll let the philosophers decide. And by that, I mean YouTubers who can't post right now. Again, existential crisis. But anyway, big shout out to Jeffrey. Much appreciated. And he gets the deep cuts, which might be what someone needs if they do feel like it's a bag of worms down there. Connecting the episodes between Dr. Ben House all the way up to our most recent. So no, much appreciated.
You threw down a little reference in the episode. He picked it up immediately. There are so many, though, so I'm going to blitz a few of them. But I'm going to say, Eric, we mentioned, and this is known as the Mandela Effect, which I think is hilarious when you actually unpack what that means, because it all started because some people were unaware that there was the great figure of Nelson Mandela who lived. And so they're like, who? And I'm like, that. Anyways, I'm not... Yeah,
supposedly, Omar.
Yeah, allegedly. So I'm not going to unpack that. I will say that I mentioned with you when we had Saul on for the last episode about supplementation and examine.com. I told everyone, and some people were kind of flabbergasted that I said we had an episode 100 something on who would win in a fight. Grizzly bear versus a silverback gorilla. Classic. Like Rogan kind of did it. We upped the ante because we gave like kind of the conditions of the silverback, what time of the year it was, what they've been doing. And someone said, the person's name is Twitch. He said, I just scrolled back for the bear versus gorilla video. Best decision ever. Really agree with all of our points.
Yeah. And, of course, that was just one in a series. We had previously discussed Komodo Dragon versus a lion. Which I think that one surprised a lot of people because they just don't know the Komodo dragon bite and that high bacteria. It's an obvious one. They immediately are going to go with lion, but then it really doesn't take much to if the lion doesn't lose immediately, he will lose due to that infection that comes, a little bit later. So it's at least a Pyrrhic victory every time for the Komodo dragon. So anyway, that one was not in the hundreds. That one was somewhere between 1 and 99. So you don't know what I'm talking about. Go check it out. But these are the hot ones. Those are easily our best 2 episodes if you want to go back and listen to them.
Yeah. Honestly, we know this. The science is just a filler. It's the thing that gets the nerds in the door. But really, what we want to do, we want to talk about big creatures fighting each other, and you're absolutely correct about the Komodo dragon. I will say, Eric, this one, I thank this person, Joe Herrera, because he's basically echoing what we said, where I was talking that shit. And I was surprised because I thought some of the USAPL boys and girls were going to get a little bit upset where I likened the USAPL Nationals. It reminded me more like a monster truck rally, a casino, like it was like at a casino and like the flashy lights and like Sunday. Whereas like the IPF is totally trying to emulate themselves after weightlifting. And so Joe said this, and it had a decent amount of upvotes. He said the IPF USAPL discussion was on point. Watching Worlds was like watching an actual sporting event. I tried to watch the USAPL Mega Nats. It was so bad, unwatchable doesn't even do it justice. I kept thinking how an ad read for the competition would go. Imagine deep radio voice doing a President's Day used car sale commercial. Like, this guy's picking up what I'm throwing down, Eric. He said, a USAPL Super Colossal Mega Nats. We've got 14 platforms, 28,000 lifters, from toddlers to geriatrics. So much simultaneous action, you'll have no idea what's going on. Flashing lights, seizure warning. Fake Elvis yelling into a microphone. Poorly timed graphics. Don't miss it. USAPL Super Colossal Mega Nats. Bro, Eric, I got to give him a round of applause. I got to be honest, bro. I think that was a hilarious even if you disagree with it, Joe, I give you a round of applause. I'm going to give you a round of applause.
I will make no comment on that. That is it is harsh. It is not, but I gotta agree. It's comedic no matter where you fall on the line of it. And if you do get offended by a comment like that, you are too invested in any powerlifting federation. Like that's the one thing I will say. But hey, I think Gino is the man. Fake Elvis or not, just got to give a big shout out to Gino. And I will say, I really do think that there is going to be a big disparity between the experience of being there versus watching the live stream, which even the commentators were joking about. So, here's another way to look at it. Just like Iron Culture started with, I'll say less than excellent audio. And I'll just point out that maybe we did not have timestamps until, I don't know, like 10 episodes ago. After
3 years in.
3 years in.
Yeah.
Just like Iron Culture started, just like the USAPL's most recent stream, you can only improve. That's all I got to say. And I'm looking forward to the forward progress because their backs against the wall. You're not going to go backwards. I don't even know what that would look like. I don't think it's possible. So, yeah. Yeah,
you'd be crawling up the wall. And Eric, the quality of these comments, that's why we're going to spend just another 3 to 4 minutes. And again, they have timestamps. I love interacting with, because Eric, some of these are really good, man. We mentioned, do you remember we both kind of shat on a little bit arm wrestling a few episodes back during our duo episode?
Mostly but mostly, I do know, yes.
Eric, I'll take the heat. It was me. I am a shit talker. And the guy called Yuppie said, super episode. He said, so lifting, and I think by extension he means also the arm wrestling, is like lobsters showing off to avoid immediate danger of actual fighting that could leave both lobsters gravely wounded, and even the winner could get the bad hand out of it. So it's just beneficial to show off and maybe compete in another proxy way to decide who's higher on the ladder, probably unconsciously for many. In some sense, that's probably why sports were born. Why else would we compete but not fight? You get status and admiration as long as it doesn't get malicious by intent.
I mean, he's not wrong. It's almost like I feel like some of the like arm wrestling is closer to fighting than lifting. So it's like we're like multiple proxies removed, So I feel like I don't have a leg to stand on or an arm to lean on. Pun intended. That wasn't very good. To criticize people who do something that is actually adversarial. So yeah, I think it is pretty funny when people in an individual sport make it into sounding like it's a combat sport. But at least in a competitive environment where you are touching another person in arm wrestling and you're directly exerting their will, it's far more similar to actual fighting, but neither one is, which I think is still a true statement. And shout out to the lobsters. The unavoidable biological hierarchies that we are locked into, which is why we must do these things.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's been an unbroken, continuous line of 300 million years of evolution. If you want to argue against that, Eric, that's just biology, baby.
That's why I don't think anything should ever be done to change society, because nothing can change.
No, it is the way it is for a reason. Now, I'm not going to let you I'm not going to let you circumvent this comment. There's just a few more, and someone said, "Always got to watch the podcast." This got the most likes, honestly, on that episode. So I'm not just going by a proxy measure here, Eric, of like what is the most valued comment, but that is notable. Always got to watch the podcast on the
This
tube.
is the most liked comment.
Yes, from the duo. Always got to watch the podcast on the tube, because otherwise, how would you know Daddy Helms got that sexy, fresh shave? Come on, dude. That's nice.
And today, it is quite fresh. So, you know what? I'm glad people notice my personal hygiene, because then there's not much else keeping me doing it, to be honest, at this stage. So I appreciate you. Yep.
Hey, and then someone said something right below it that I actually appreciate this podcast so much. Like, it's two people who have no motive but to really help, no conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, a very rare find in the fitness industry. Eric, I'm actually going to double down on that. That is too damn sweet. But I'll say we actually lose money by doing this podcast. But do we lose money if we gain friends along the way? That's my question. That's my question to you.
And the answers you can find in your subscription to Mass or by buying the Muscle and Strength Pyramids. Edition 2. Twice as good as the first edition. Now, I can't. I have to say thank you. It's a very kind comment. We do our best to be of service, and I try to brush it off a little bit by doing the opposite, because irony is fun. But no, it's good to be acknowledged for that, and hopefully what we're doing makes a positive difference. And if not, well, hey, at least we're distracted before we die.
Hey, Eric, I'm gonna say this. I'm going to read some LOTR comments in a second, but the last one before that was one of us said, "Lol, whatever it is, we're atop of it," which was the it doesn't matter the structure, but Eric and myself, we're atop of it. And he said, "Because it's early morning and I'm getting ready for the day, only watching the first couple of minutes already gave me tickles inside. Can't wait for the late evening joy of banter indulgence with a sprinkle of learnedness." Come on, Eric.
I love it. And this commenter, they get the formula. Sprinkle of content, mostly banter. Yeah. And all I know is this person does not click on, where is it? 30 minutes in, that's when they start talking about something reasonable. They listen to the first 30 minutes, because they know that's the actual value that you're getting from this podcast, for sure.
Big V. Now last two Lord of the Rings comments, because we just started riffing you and myself, because of course once we go down, I told you about Ecthelion. Okay, standing tall against Goth, like all the things against Gothmog, Balrog, Epic, all that stuff. That's us atop the pyramid, just ready whatever the opposition is. But we started an episode.
Tower of Orthanc, but sure.
Well, so he said, Rick Lee said, as soon as Tower of Orthanc came up, I was all in on this episode.
My man.
And then the last person, Pelvin, said, "I don't know what is more impressive, their knowledge of training and fitness, or their ability to recall the details of Lord of the Rings." Come on.
I mean, there are a few things worth knowing in this world, and how to get jacked, and obscure mythology of a made-up world in the Silmarillion. Those are probably at the top of the list. Yeah,
at the tippity top, bro. So I'm gonna say this, Eric. I appreciate everyone who did listen. If you skipped ahead, no problem. We're going to get to the topic du jour. But I do feel, just because we were getting in a great rhythm, and that's why more people were leaving comments, Eric, we would read like 2 to 3 at the start of an episode, and we had done 3 to 4 where we had guests, and we wanted to be aware of their time, make sure to talk over them, and give them the illusion that they're participating in conversation, even though it's just like, you and me, soliloquy after soliloquy of power. What are we talking about today? This is the monster one, capital M.
Right. So this is going to be coming out on, I believe, July 11th, because that'll be Monday. Yep. And for those who were paying attention, only 10 days ago, the most recent issue of Mass came out, And there's something we've been doing in mass where we have started to make one article, the quote unquote cover story of each issue, that is not only available to subscribers, but also just put freely available as an article on Stronger by Science. And Greg had the opening one, which was last month's issue that came out June 1st. And that was a deep dive into the level of female participation as participants in strength and resistance training related research, and potentially examining why and how that has or hasn't changed over time. And that's a great one to read. Definitely check it out on Stronger by Science. And then I had the honor and privilege of trying to follow that. And as you know, following Greg on something that is written is a tough act. But I think I did all right. Far less important topic, but I think the way I wrote it and the things I connected, I think hopefully connected some dots for some people. So, as you know, Omar, the topics of like metabolic adaptation, or AKA adaptive thermogenesis, which is a term I prefer, and body fat set points are something that people talk about all the time. And that's because people are very interested in, if you look at what they click on, what they buy, and the voices that rise to prominence in the fitness community, evidence-based or otherwise, I would point out. This is something that you will see people take an angle of science or an angle of just anecdote because people are interested in this. And that's looking yucky all the time, as you kind of hinted at the beginning of this podcast. And it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of interest in bodybuilding by non-competitive bodybuilders, because, they're exuding or they're displaying something relevant to most people. That's why bodybuilders are on the covers of men's magazines. Not all bodybuilding magazines are just consumed by bodybuilders. So there's an interest in not only getting lean, but staying lean and looking lean all the time. And this is something that, in a feedback loop, the industry also reinforces. They'll take a picture of a lean person with an attractive significant other, or someone who's positioned in that way, in front of a nice car, with a nice background, like on a mansion. I mean, I can think of YouTubers who, are hanging out in someone's mansion, probably not theirs, with someone's car. At least it's theirs currently if they're renting it, with a number of people around them who are very attractive but don't speak, which is just, a sign of a healthy relationship. And and they just happen to not have their shirt on, and they happen to be pretty shredded,
Right.
And they aren't trying to sell you anything except everything. So yeah, like that's all over the place. The positioning of leanness as happiness, as leanness as success. And I think, while I don't view it that way, I'm absolutely someone who, every time I diet down for a show, like when I get shredded, I go through that very challenging, grueling process. Once I get there, because of the effort I put forth, and because I really do appreciate bodybuilding from an artistic, aesthetic sense. Like, I think a body that displays muscular anatomy and you can see everything is awesome. I think it looks really cool. I do often ask myself the question, and I kind of play with the idea, I wonder how lean I could stay. Could I stay shredded? Are there ways I can manipulate my diet and my mindset and my activity, or something approximating it? Like, how lean could I stay? And there's people who have entire podcasts, websites, books, or followings dedicated to that. And with various different approaches. I think arguably a large sector of like the intermittent fasting community is dedicated to that, bodyrecomposition.com, right? And like I said, this is a very prominent thing in and out of the quote unquote evidence or science driven community. And interestingly enough, it's one of the things that is not well understood. Like, I think we know anecdotally that most people have trouble staying lean. Like, I think the most obvious case in point is the people who are getting the leanest, bodybuilders, don't walk around in stage shape all the time. You could hand wave that and dismiss it and say, well, that's because they're also then trying to get bigger and come back better next season. But anyone who's actually competed in bodybuilding and been around the community knows that it's actually because, and unavoidable, that they're incredibly food focused and they can't stop thinking about food, and after shows a big binge fest happens and people gain 10 to 40 pounds within weeks, sometimes post show. Just as a fun aside to give people an idea of what this can sometimes look like. So when you compete in a show, they either ban Dream Tan, which is a specific type of tanning product that doesn't really dry. It's oil based, but it looks great. It has little gold or bronze flecks in it, so it reflects the light well. So you don't have to get multiple layers and coats of, say, like Pro-Tan or Jantana, and then put an oil on top and make sure it's the right amount of oil, but not too much to get that reflection. Dream Tan is just to put it on with no base. You put it on thick enough, it's got the flecks, it reflects the lights. You kind of look like a bronze statue. And that is not all the time, but for many competitors, and depending on the federation and division, typically not with more complex suits like figure competitors, but in like male bodybuilding and other bodybuilding divisions, it is often the preferred color, but promoters hate it because it doesn't dry. So it gets on stuff. So, two competitors pass each other in a hallway, and most venues, you're renting from a high school to use their auditorium. So if you leave a bunch of brown smudges on the wall, you're going to get charged for that. And there's no money in bodybuilding promotion. Like, you're trying to break even most of the time. So anyway, typically Dream Tan is banned, or what they have is the whole backstage area is like covered in paper, like just brown paper taped together so that the whole place is proofed against, your clumsy mud covered ass. Right. And so one year competing at what is now known as the Muscle Mayhem, but I think back then it might've been the Cap City still. I can't quite remember. There were these like 3 figure competitors who had filled up the entire backstage floor, writing the foods that they were going to have post-show and the restaurants they wanted to go, with this list that covered basically the length of maybe a standard size living room. So like, I'm talking like, donuts, Frosted Flakes, BJ's cookie pie, or like all this stuff just listed. And the crazy thing is, I don't think they were done competing. You know what I'm saying? So like, they hadn't got their placings. I don't think they had finished their night show stuff. They hadn't got their awards. These are people they dieted, 3 to 6 months, I'm guessing, to get into like this position that is ostensibly very important to them. And what are they focusing on? What they're going to eat when it's all over, So that's just, and the funny thing is, I didn't sit there in judgment of them, because that thing is inside me too. I'm just pretending to be normal and trying to stay in the moment. So yeah, it is very normal to get extremely food focused. And I would say that is the primary driver for why people, like, I think, like, you've heard the arguments, and we've talked about it previously, and there's been also some great articles written by like Eric Trexler and back and forths with, Menno Henselmans about, P ratios. We've talked about that on Iron Culture. The idea that, oh man, you actually gain more muscle if you stay lean. And we know that's not actually true. But if bodybuilders believed it to be true, with the kind of willpowers that bodybuilders have and the willingness to do things that others won't, if it actually was beneficial to stay really lean in the off season and put on size, they would do it if they could. But I think A, it's not, and B, it's just incredibly challenging, no matter how hardcore you are, to stay shredded all the time. So the question is why? And the question is, I think it's one that more people who are not competitors are interested in, but I think it's really interesting to see that even the people who know how to get shredded reliably, repeatedly, struggle to stay really lean. But it's still something that I think is still sold. It's sold a lot. It's pitched like, if you just do this right, you could stay shredded. And all the people who don't are doing it wrong. And I think you'd expect it to die out with more information coming around, and more people talking about it, and more of these anecdotal examples. But I think in some ways, the way social media works, especially Instagram and the fitness industry, it has made it seem more possible to stay lean all the time, because there are more outliers for you to look at. Like, we've talked about this in the context of powerlifting. Like, if you squat 500 pounds in the 93 kilo class, you're actually in the top 20, maybe 15% of powerlifters in the world. I mean, among other powerlifters, you were actually stronger than a large majority of other powerlifters. However, if you were to look at powerlifting, you would absolutely feel weak. Like, you've got people totaling close to 950 kilos in like around the 93 kilo division. Like, shout out Ashton. We've had him on the podcast. And you've got like, Jonathan Keiko we've had on close to 900 kilos, and maybe, even like if you look at recent worlds and you look at, Brandon Petrie, like a 900 kilo total is like kind of top of the cream of the crop, but there's 10, 20 people deep who are all close to that, who are competing with it. And then you think about like the top 5%, you got people, who are totaling in the low 800s, high 700s. And anyone who's below that, since it seems like there's hundreds of these people, just feels weak, despite the fact that you've got, a 700 kilo total at 93. You're stronger than the vast majority of everyone on the planet, right? But because the way social media works is you fill up your feed with the outliers become the norm. So it all of a sudden sets expectations for you that are wholly unrealistic. And certainly there are some people who can stay lean and they can walk around reasonably shredded, and they can, and sometimes I think honestly, they come by the belief, the influencers themselves, that if people would follow what I would do, this is possible. It's not hard for me. So that's my life experience. So let me teach you what I did. And you see a lot of people, replicating what they're doing, but not getting the same outcomes. So I don't know. Do you feel like that's an accurate background of kind of the world we live in, and what I'm seeing before we talk about like what's actually going on under the hood here?
Eric, you're being too coherent, because I almost wish that there was a portion of our audience that we had it not convinced, but I almost want to play the other side. And what I mean when I say that is that, as you described it perfectly about what happens to an individual when they get really lean and the different systems, it kind of reminds me of a few different things. So it reminds me first of someone that has no experience. There's an experiential gap of having not gone through it. So like some of the watches, let's say MMA, it's like, I wouldn't let myself get knocked out. I'm just built different. I'm like, you actually have no idea what you're talking about. Or you could go deeper though. You could go like in physics where they talked about the first mover, where they're trying, I'm not trying to get in a religion here, but like, where does God fit into all this? And they're like, well, perhaps he described set things in motion. I'm like, okay. Or like in economics where they talked before in classical economics about the silent invisible hand of the market, which is just this ephemeral thing to describe what's going on. I kind of feel in the shreddy, I want to ask you about this because I'm sure you've heard so many bad takes by coaches. Let me just really quickly, I want you to define after this shredded, like what does that mean, like what are we talking in terms of leanness, but two, just some of those biological mechanisms, because some of the people, the retort that unfortunately that Iron Cult wouldn't say, but I do just want to talk about and get your opinion on Quickband. You describe those two-figure competitors, and we talk about this whole, I would put forth, if there's a silent hand of the market in economics, in fitness, that thing that's all encompassing that really means nothing is like willpower, motivation, how bad do you want it, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. Well, if you really want to get shredded, your mind, the central controller, which is your mind, the central governor, is independent of everything else, and it can override any other system, rather than having these feedback loops of what you choose to do physically to your body will change your hormonal landscape, which will then have a cascading effect on your mental disposition, like all these other things. Can you, Eric, just really quickly, I want you to define, when we talk about to the audience, like getting shredded and what does that mean, like when this, and I know we've talked about that before, but just so we're all on the same page, but is any potential response, because some of these videos do pop off, some of these episodes, I do think, because we're going to have shredded probably in the title, man, I expect 20 to 30% more exposure. There might be someone listening, or a portion, they're not really our audience, but might be listening, be like, I don't really buy what Eric, like your first, like if this was a conversation, Eric, and it's like, is this a given? Can we assume this, that when one gets lean, I think there's a small portion of pushback. It's like, well, not everyone, to your point, like the outlier, like that doesn't actually happen. Like yeah, it happened, but it's not going to affect me long term. Like if I wanted it bad enough, I would just do it.
Yeah, no, I think to be clear, yeah, when I say shredded, I mean basically hanging out at essential body fat levels, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking 4 to 6% for men, or 12 to 14% for women, depending on like that's the rough conversion, and like basically, I think even getting close to that, I would kind of count in that, like we're talking like 1970s and 80s bodybuilding lean, like you don't have striated glutes, but you pretty much don't have any visible fat, like a very well defined fitness cover model, I think could fit into this. Like a lot of the images you get where they're not necessarily competitive bodybuilders, but they could be. I think your typical Muscle magazine cover, that is on the leaner side or leaner is what I'm talking about. So yeah. And I think to your point, to speak to the people who might not buy that, well, first let me say that my position is not going to start with a conclusion of, no, you can't stay shredded. Because I think, first of all, like if the question is, can you stay shredded? The answer is yes, like unequivocally. Like if I locked myself in a room and had food delivered that was equal to the lowest calories I would need to maintain a shredded condition, I would get really, really lean, and then I'd stay there. You know, the real question is, would it be worth it? Would I like it? Would I have full physiological function? And what would be the cost? And if I wasn't locked in a room, would I be able to do it? And I think that is a very different question than, is it physically possible? Because of course, like, yes, if people die of starvation, they don't die of starvation with a ton of body fat on them, unless like it's also they're not getting water or micronutrients. But absolutely, I'm not claiming that there is some, you know, like magic going on here that prevents people from getting shredded. I do think everyone can get shredded. I don't think everyone can get shredded in their normal environment. And I think very few people can stay shredded, even fewer than those who can get shredded in their normal environment. And I think that's an interesting question of why. And I will say that, you know, some of the pushback you might get from this is, well, hey, if you look at, you know, Omar, you like MMA, like it's a weight class restricted sport, very high energy output. There's a lot of guys and gals in MMA who walk around looking pretty lean like all the time, right? That's real. There are absolutely, like if you watch the Olympics, like you watch the gymnasts, or if you watch there's a number of sports you can think of, sprinters, jumpers, and some swimming sports, cyclists, like they're shredded most of the time, you know, or very, very lean. But I think that we have to be very aware of selection bias. The same thing that applies to the algorithm favoring the most impressive bodies. And just because there's 7 billion people on the planet, you're going to be able to fill up a feed with hundreds of these people and make it seem much more common, is that when you watch the Olympics, which is selecting for the people who are truly, I wouldn't say they're actually built for the sport, but the combination of factors that goes into place that permits elite performance, certain things have to be in place. You know, you will run faster with less mass on your body that is not contributing to your speed. So people who, for whatever reason, and we're going to get into the reasons, are able to be shredded and be okay physiologically, they don't need to be locked in a room like me. They're going to be the people who excel in sprinting. And some people can get pretty far. Maybe they're not quite as have the favorable genetics, but you know they're pretty good at self-regulation, and they do stay in this kind of weight-reduced, semi-dieted state all the time, and they're lean enough that they're able to compete with these more natural quote-unquote sprinters who have that characteristic of having, you know, naturally very low body fat. Theirs is low enough so they can get close to that, and they don't have to push themselves so hard that they can't recover from training, and they can hang. But when you look at like the top 5 in any sport at the elite level, you're going to see very similar characteristics in most cases. And that's not because if you just got that one weird trick or you did the right things, you could get there. It is because at a certain level, the sport selects for who can get there, you know? So again, that is selection bias. So I think absolutely, you could collect all the people in the world who could stay shredded, get them together, and you can have like a convention of people who are naturally shredded, and it would seem, and if you went to it, you'd be like, Eric is full of shit. But there is still, you know, another, you know, 6.99 billion people on the planet who couldn't get into the convention without dieting first, right? So anyway, I think those are important things to say up front, so we're on the same page. And the funny thing is, Omar, how often do you hear people talking about like set points in the bodybuilding community, or just like the online fitness space in general, if they're interested in body composition?
Very often.
Yeah. Now, the idea of the set point, you'll hear it discussed either with just like as a set point or a settling point, and I've even discussed it in this way. And it's discussed often by people in like kind of the quote unquote evidence-based community, but it's actually kind of this bastardization of the actual concepts. So the original idea of a set point theory came out in like 1953 by a researcher named Kennedy, and it was called the Lipostatic Model. So if you're aware of it, lipids, fat, lipostatic means that like a thermostat, the amount of body fat that you have is regulated in some way. And the original theory stated that there is a body fat set point that, like a thermostat, when you're below it or above it, it sends signals to your brain to result in the behaviors that encourage food consumption or energy expenditure reduction to basically conserve or produce energy expenditure to get you back to your settling point range, or your set point range. So if you go above your set point, okay, sweet. Now we're gonna make you fuller, and we're gonna make you move more, type of deal. And the opposite if you go below it. And this model, like I said, it's like 70 years old now, but it was largely theoretical until the 90s when the hormone leptin was actually identified. So leptin, people are probably familiar with it, maybe not. It's basically seen as the metabolic master controller. It's kind of like one of the very first initiating things that happens. It leads to the cascade of all the other changes that occur in the body. And the original mouse models where they investigated this, they would knock out the gene responsible for producing leptin, and they would see changes in body weight. And they observed it in other conditions. And essentially what they saw was that leptin acted as that theoretical signaler in the lipostatic model. You feed animals a whole lot, they gain weight, body fat goes up, leptin goes up, and then they would lose weight if you put them back in an ad-limited environment. And the converse was true when you dieted them, right? Diet them, leptin goes down, put them back in an ad-limited environment, they would overfeed, gain a whole bunch of weight, and get back. So it seemed like the lipostatic model was it, However, there's a number of things that doesn't make sense with this lipostatic, this straight up normal model. Leptin doesn't behave, especially in humans, the way that the signal is supposed to in the lipostatic model. And I think importantly, what else was not going on in the 1950s? The obesity epidemic, right? Mm. So as society advanced, we started to see that the lipostatic model, it fails to explain what we observe in society. Like the lipostatic model would suggest that the obesity epidemic couldn't happen because we have these strong physiological regulators which prevent us from getting too heavy. Okay. So for one, that's an issue. Also, the original theories based upon, okay, if leptin is this master controller and if it's, it helps you defend against gaining too much weight, we would expect to see in people with obesity that they would have some type of leptin deficiency, right? For some reason, they're not producing leptin. That's why they have obesity, right? Exactly not true. In fact, the highest levels of leptin you'll see are in people with common forms of obesity. You can, of course, become, you can have obesity because you have a leptin deficiency, but that's not normal. Like the standard type of obesity that we see, you see individuals with very high levels of leptin. So it seems to poorly prevent weight gain, and it also doesn't follow just the amount of fat mass we have. So some of the earliest investigations we have suggested that far and away, the largest explanatory variable for what our serum leptin levels are is body fat. So there's a study by Constantine, for example. They got nearly 300 participants, ranging from lean to people with obesity. And they had a 0.85 correlation, means it explains about 72% of the variance. It's very strong between body fat percentage and circulating leptin levels. So absolutely, at baseline, you will know that serum leptin directly and proportionately tied to your body fat levels. This is also why it's generally a little bit higher in women, because they have higher essential fat levels, right? However, when you start dieting, leptin immediately goes down before you start losing body fat. And it falls precipitously too. So it precedes fat loss. So very early, once leptin was discovered and the nuances of its physiology were discovered, we abandoned the set point model. No one actually buys the lipostatic model. And to be fair to the community who talks about this, we say set point, but we don't mean the lipostatic model. And most people will say settling point to acknowledge that, also environment impacts this in some way. But there actually is a model that's been developed over the last 20 years, if I recall correctly. It's reviewed really well in a 2011 paper by Speakman and colleagues called the dual intervention model. And this is the idea that there are 2 points. There's an upper intervention point and a lower intervention point where our bodies will intervene and it will do things physiologically to influence our energy expenditure and energy intake to defend against weight gain or weight loss, respectively. However, between those 2 intervention points, the dominating variable that is going to predict our body composition is going to be the environment. And when I say the environment, I basically mean everything except physiology. So whether you're dieting or not, whether you are in a food desert, whether you work from home and never have to walk or go anywhere, right? All the things that we've talked about in the quote unquote dieting space or body composition space apply to your environment, from your nutrition education to your interest in getting lean to what have you. Like, do you like fruits and vegetables? Pretty much all the things that aren't your metabolic physiology, right? Another important thing here is that the lower and upper intervention points are unfortunately not created equal, at least in humans. So the idea is that there are threats to survival of a species going above or below either one of these intervention points. Hence, over time, through selection, we have developed these 2 points because they help us survive and pass on our genes. I think the lower intervention point being there makes a lot of sense, right? That's famine. And that's something all species have to contend with, whether they're herbivores or whether they're carnivores or whether they are somewhere in between, right? Omnivores is, I believe, what that's called. And so, for example, ice age happens. We're going to probably lose a lot of body fat, and then our physiology is going to adapt to the degree it can to prevent starvation, so we can make it through the winter, burning less calories, requiring less calories, limping along but nearly dead, not trying to produce more children, and therefore the need for more energy. Okay, thank God, winter's over, and we can continue. Likewise, getting too heavy, like basically being, heavier with a lot of, tasty body fat and being slower, not great for survival in certain time frames. And when you look at animal models like mice, which are prey animals, they're very good at defending both intervention points. And that makes a lot of sense. Like a fat, juicy mouse is going to be the one to get eaten because it's slow and tasty, right? However, in humans, we see a far better defense of our lower intervention point rather than our upper intervention point. And this makes sense as well. There was not that long of a period where humans were, threatened as prey, right? Very quickly, we realized we could have pointy sticks. Very quickly, we got fire, right? So arguably, the thing that has been a greater threat to us is, famine. And famine is a consequence of other things like widespread plague, war, etc. When you think of all the things that killed off a lot of people, famine is almost always part of it. I mean, I think it's even one of the 5 horsemen of apocalypse. Like it's apocryphal. It's built into our religions even, right? So it's unsurprising that we are quite good at defending the lower intervention point, but not very well equipped to defend that upper intervention point. And this model explains the obesity epidemic, right? Now we've got something that fits. We know environment plays a role. We know that we have also physiology, but instead of just having environment and this one kind of fuzzy set point, which people is what colloquially describe as a settling point, the model that really makes a lot of sense is this idea of having an upper and lower intervention point, and these two areas, basically between the two or above and below it, where the dominating factor that dictates our body composition is environment or physiology. And of course, it's not that environment doesn't influence you when you go above or below, it's just no longer the dominant factor. So I think that is probably the first thing to start with to help people understand what is going on. And that's the only model that actually fits all the observations. Not only does it fit with our understanding of leptin physiology, okay, so yeah, it's tied to body fat. However, it's not just tied to body fat. Like we actually have leptin receptors in a lot of the cells in our body. It's not just a brain, an influence on the hypothalamus, although that is very important. We also produce leptin in the gut. We have gastric leptin. So yeah, most of the serum leptin is explained, like I said, 72% of the variance by our adiposity. There are acute changes in leptin in response to changes in macronutrients, changes in energy balance, and in changes to food selection and even activity. But those things, you kind of think of it as the transient shifts. And once we go back to energy balance, or once we are simply, returning to baseline after we've been between meals, our serum leptin levels, our baseline circulating, typical, spend most of the day here, are going to be dictated by body fat.
Eric, when I said monster episode, it's already shaping up very nicely. I suppose it is helpful for a lot of coaches when they are trying to describe the concept of the settling point because they observe it in clients or whatnot. Then when they're trying to lean down and they're I think people assume, one of the assumptions, Eric, I think from coaches would be that if you're following a plan, it kind of works in a stepwise manner. Meaning that as you gradually lose weight, okay, you got what's the calculus here? Got to lower the calories a little bit. Okay, increase the steps. And there's some theoretical point that then, like it has been, as you said, colloquially called the settling point, where it's like, well, everything just kind of gets thrown out all of a sudden. And of course, it's like, what is happening? It's got to be then your body rigidly holding on to that as a means of just describing that general thing that they observe.
Yeah, and I think people do struggle with multi-layered concepts and things that have differing levels of influence at different stages of a process and similar influences. So it's the natural human thing to default to a singular explanation for a complex thing. Like, oh, it's just, you get leaner and it makes it worse, right? So a diet, you get leaner and leaner and leaner, it gets harder. And sometimes you hear kind of incorrect and generally cruel or shitty narratives of like, yeah, this person still is obese. And, I don't know why it's hard for them. Like, they're not even lean yet, So that's not quite accurate, right? That's not quite accurate because that's focusing purely on the body fat. And you also hear it the other way. And ironically, where I see this most present is actually in another sector of the research. So this is something that people aren't quite as familiar with, although I think I've introduced the concept a number of times in Iron Culture, and that's energy availability. Which has been studied since about the early 2000s or late 90s. So it's much newer than some of the metabolic adaptation and settling point, set point, upper lower intervention point stuff that's been going on since the 50s and 40s. Like if you think about some of the early Minnesota semi-starvation study in the late 40s, early 50s, that's what we've been interested in. What prevents people from losing weight, and what are metabolic adaptations or adaptive thermogenesis? And unsurprisingly, for one, it's 30 years preceding at least the research on energy availability and REDS, but it also has a different interest. We're combating the obesity epidemic, right? We're quantifying the amount of energy expenditure changes that we have from adaptive thermogenesis. So of course, people interested in dieting are going to be more focused on what are the barriers and what are the quantitative outcomes that are changing energy expenditure in response to dieting, and what are the causes of that. However, energy availability and relative energy deficiency in sports, or REDS, the symptoms that come from low energy availability occurring chronically, again, newer phase of research in the scientific community. Additionally, it's focused on something different. It's asking the question, what is an appropriate energy intake for athletes and exercisers to maintain health and performance, right? It's not about how do we get athletes more shredded. It's more so saying that these athletes who I talked about, who benefit from having lower body fats, they're at higher risk of developing REDS, and that's a problem that we want to solve. But let's be honest, health is a secondary concern when you're hanging out in the I want to get yucky, camp. It's how do I not be so unhealthy that I hate my life? I want to be healthy enough to live in a shredded body, but any more than that is superfluous, right? So yeah, I think that's why there's not much awareness of energy availability or REDS. So for those who aren't aware, energy availability is not energy balance. And they're often conflated because people understand what energy balance is. Calories in, calories out. How do I get leaner? Yada, yada, yada. That's kind of the focus. Energy availability is actually the expression of how much energy is available and quote unquote left over for physiological function when I consider my activity. And it's actually mathematically calculated. And what you do is you take, your total energy intake minus your exercise energy expenditure, and you divide that by your lean body mass. So for example, you could have an energy availability of 40 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass, as an example, right? Or you could be at 20. So it's very simple. And there's actually been a ton of research on the thresholds of energy availability when you start to see symptoms of relative energy deficiency in sport, okay? So the cause is low energy availability chronically. The outcome are symptoms of REDS, right? And the threshold has generally been observed to be around 30. But this is absolutely not a hardline rule. I mean, if you just think about this concept, like what do you count as NEAT? What do you count as exercise activity? So there's going to be differences in who you look at and what populations. There's also seems to be some sex differences. And there is there's a paper out there on natural bodybuilders, and when they start to lose lean body mass, that suggests like a relatively low threshold compared to when you start to see amenorrhea in the female athlete triad in women, which is slightly higher. So it's around like 25 in that. And there's also like high energy output athletes sometimes get symptoms of REDS in the 30 to 45 kcal per kilogram of lean body mass range. So it's by no means like, here's the threshold, you go below 30 and you're screwed, you're going to get REDS. Above it, you're fine. It's more like everyone has their own threshold somewhere, that if you have too low of energy for your energy output, you will start to have negative effects on performance and health. And when I say performance and health, I mean like really broad-ranging effects, because this is coming down to like systemic effects in the body. We're talking about affecting the HPG and the HPA axis, right? So all starting in the hypothalamus, like I mentioned earlier, and that having ultimate control over our endocrine status. So impacting our sexual function, our reproductive function, immunological function, the whole 9 yards. If you look at the typical diagrams for REDS, if you just like Google REDS and you look at images in Google, you're going to see these spokes on a wheel. And in the center is going to be REDS, and it's going to have negative effects on immune function, reproductive health. It's going to have negative effects on bone health. It's going to have negative effects on performance, psychological effects as well. And basically, it mirrors all the things that bodybuilders talk about that they experience as they get leaner. Now, here's the wild thing, Omar. If you were paying attention there, there's no point where energy availability takes into account your body fat percentage. It's purely related to your energy intake relative to your energy output with respect to your lean body mass, and not saying, oh, and there's a correction factor for fat mass or anything like that. And indeed, when you look at this line of research, they make the case, and I think they do so because they're not really looking at the other lines of research on adaptive thermogenesis and set points and settling points and the dual intervention model. These are somewhat separate, although very related lines of research. They make the case that it all just does come down to energy availability. And I think this is unsurprising because they're looking at athletes, right? And there are plenty of athletes who are way leaner than the average population. And in many ways, this is true, that if you take someone independent of their body fat, and if you put them on a really low calorie diet, they're going to experience negative effects. So we have to establish, okay, what are we looking at here? There's not only effects of being leaner, but there's also effects of being on a crash diet or on a starvation diet. And then what are the links between the two, and how do they compound, and why? So we know that there's REDS. We know it's linked to energy availability. So if you have far too low of energy intake relative to your expenditure, think of that basically as a crash diet, it's going to be shitty. And these are two independent signals, right? We've also talked about why it's probably not a good idea to have the typical old school 8 to 12 week diet to get shredded as a bodybuilder, because you've got to lose 30 pounds in that period. So you've got to have a massive deficit, right? Which also requires a very low energy availability. So you can get similar symptoms from being really, really low in body fat to being really, really low in calories. Because like I said, once you go in a deficit, there's drops in leptin. And when your body fat levels are too low, you have lower circulating leptin. So the same initial cause, where that signal to the hypothalamus is vastly reduced, is resulting in the same outcomes of suppression of hormone status, suppression of the immune system, drops in energy expenditure, more parasympathetic dominance, reductions in thyroid output, the whole 9 yards. But the REDS research and the metabolic adaptation and body fat research, they're describing the same thing in two different ways. So the adaptive thermogenesis research is quantifying the reductions in energy expenditure due to these effects, while the energy availability in REDS research is describing the effects on health and performance that are due to the same thing, right? So now we have to kind of connect the two. How do we connect the two here, right? So people are, adaptive thermogenesis, we're normally focusing on the reduction in energy expenditure, and we're not focusing on what does that mean. Like if you read a paper on adaptive thermogenesis, it'll describe all the systems that are affected, and how these all result in a reduction in energy expenditure. They don't say, what does it feel like to have no thyroid output, right? What does it feel like to be burning 15% less calories at the same body weight? That's REDS is what that feels like, right? So they're describing the same thing, but from two different perspectives. And the unfortunate thing is that when we look at adaptive thermogenesis, it persists. And it persists not purely dependent upon what you eat, okay? So there's a classic study by, I believe, Rosenbaum in 2008. And what they did was they took 7 trios of participants who were weight matched. So they had the same body weight, all right? So this is a total of 21 participants in 7 groupings of 3, in each case with similar body composition and weight. However, how they got to that body weight differed. In each one of those 7 trios, there was one person who that was their walk-around weight. They were naturally at that weight. It was their habitual weight. They'd been weight stable, okay? And these trios went all the way from, quote unquote, normal body weights in a body BMI category wise, all the way up to people with obesity. And then the other 2 people were people who had dieted to get down to that body weight. One of them had done it within the last 5 to 8 weeks. So they'd recently completed a diet to get to that body mass. And the other had been there for a year or longer. So you had 2 weight-reduced individuals, one who recently finished dieting, one who was at least a year ago, and one person who was habitually at that weight. Now here's the unfortunate part. In both weight-reduced individuals, whether it happened a year ago or longer, or a month or 2 ago, they had a reduced energy expenditure at the group level when you take these 21 people together, and to a similar degree. So adaptive thermogenesis, the reduction in energy expenditure compared to what would be expected based upon your body mass, was reduced on average by about 15%. So their total energy expenditure was 85% of what you'd expect. That's the mean value, not the extent of individual experiences, even a year or longer after having lost this weight. So that sucks, right? However, just to point things out to people, like there's a lot of people who walk around at a lower energy expenditure and have lost weight and keep it off for a long time. This is not a death knell, but it's important to point out that there's a persistent adaptation. So for those who are really kind of connecting the dots and maybe are a few steps ahead of me, this tells you something about maybe why I'm anti-reverse diet, because it focuses on eating more food rather than thinking at all about the body composition change. So that's why we need to have both sides of this coin. We need to think about not only your quote unquote short-term energy availability, what you're currently eating and how that relates to energy balance, but also the long-term energy availability, quote unquote, if you will, which is going to be dictating how much circulating leptin do I have at baseline and between meals and for most of the day based upon my adiposity. And if I'm below that lower intervention point and I'm also on low energy availability, I'm going to feel like a whole lot of crap. But if only one of those 2 things is present, it'll just be some crap, right? And I think if we combine all these concepts, we can understand a few things. So between the upper and lower intervention point, the thing that's going to dictate how bad you feel, how sustainable the diet's going to be, the degree to which you experience metabolic adaptation or adaptive thermogenesis is going to be primarily related to energy availability. Meaning that if you are somebody who has a very high body fat and you go on a hardcore crash diet, it's going to be hard to sustain. You're going to maybe fall off the wagon. You're going to be likely to regain some weight, and you're probably going to experience some reductions in energy expenditure, right? That matches the observations that we see in the real world. And this goes far deeper than just those kind of surface level things. So Lukes, who's done a lot of the seminal research that led to the development of REDS, she actually found that she took a group of women with obesity and she put them on basically a starvation diet, a fasting diet, and they started to notice signs that they were going to lose their menstrual cycle. So indeed, you can get the same thing by putting someone on a crash diet or dieting down them for a long time, slow and steady, to the point where they just can't have enough circulating leptin to keep that system running from either one of those 2 signals or the combined of the 2. So we've got an interaction now. Now we're taking the backdrop of the dual intervention model. We're taking our understanding of adaptive thermogenesis, which seems to persist even as long as you're weight reduced, which I think is another way of saying below your lower intervention point. And we're also taking the energy availability understanding in REDS. So between these 2 intervention points, the dominant factor that's going to dictate the success of your diet and the sustainability of maintaining the body fat you achieve long term is going to be how you got there, right? It's going to be your environment, and energy availability is part of that, because you can modify part of that equation. By simply eating more, you'll be able to be in a status of, I'm in a deficit, but I have sufficient energy availability, which can happen, right? However, once you start to go below your lower intervention point, that's when you're basically receiving a double whammy. And what I mean by that is that in most cases, to go below your lower intervention point, it's going to take you going below what would be considered a threshold for low energy availability. Like, I don't know many bodybuilders at all who can get shredded without going below like that rough threshold of 30 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass. It's just very hard to do. Like, if you math that out and then you compare it to what are all the levels of calories that bodybuilders report consuming, it's like hundreds of calories more. So it's like you can't get shredded and have enough energy availability. That's a built-in part of the system. And then when you consider that your energy output decreases due to dieting, it makes it even harder, right? Because you have to lower your calories further. So for example, in the article that's on Stronger by Science, I did a little bit of a calculation for someone. I said, hey, let's take a woman who starts at 77 kilos, at say 20% body fat, and she diets all the way down to 12%. She gets shredded. She drops 10% of her body weight to do that. And let's say we expect, like the data on weight-reduced individuals, that study by Rosenbaum that I talked about, the individuals who dieted to get there, they had lost 10% of their body weight. So like to like, all right? And they had 85% of their expected energy expenditure. So, all right, let's take the Ketch-McCardle equation. Let's plug it in. We are 70 kilos. We're 12% body fat. We're a female. What is our energy expenditure? And then we're going to take 85% of that, okay? Sweet. Now we know what your energy intake would be. Now let's compare being sedentary to moderately active, because that's the level of activity you have, and call that your exercise activity output. And then we'd look at, okay, just to eat at maintenance, what would you need to be consuming? And it comes out to an energy availability value of about 27. So just the fact of dieting down and having the expected mean average drop in energy expenditure, independent of thinking about any other factors here, we see that if it didn't, let's say body fat didn't matter, just the fact that adaptive thermogenesis occurs means that most people, on average, will not be able to sustain a shredded condition without experiencing some symptoms of REDS, which for a lot of people, aren't going to make it worth it. And that's assuming that there's no impact of body fat, which I think is a very hard proposition, given everything I've talked about and the way we understand leptin physiology. So how am I doing connecting these dots? Does it make sense, Omar?
Phenomenal.
Beautiful. All right. So yeah, I think that a tough thing for people to grasp is the difference between energy availability and energy balance. And what I just described there was hopefully the connector that made sense. I described a situation where you can be at maintenance, but be in a status of low energy availability, right? And that's the key thing, is that energy availability and energy balance are connected, but somewhat distinct, right? So to be in a surplus for this person who is at 27, kcals per kilogram of lean body mass once dieted down, might still put them at a status of low energy availability if it's a very small surplus. Again, why I'm not a huge fan of the idea of reverse diet, right? So purely from the idea, without thinking about a lower or upper intervention point at all, just from an energy availability REDS lens, we see that there's a problem. But I don't think it's a tenable conclusion to say it only comes down to energy availability, because then the question is, all right, so why do people who are rate reduced maintain a lower energy expenditure? There's no reason for that to occur if we just say it's about the energy you consume, right? Like, okay, why is a weight-reduced person burning 85% of their calories? It just comes down to what they're eating. It shouldn't happen. So we know that there's something else there, and that data exists. It's all of the data that we have on body composition. So there must be something that is keeping you in this weight-reduced, reduced energy expenditure state. And that's probably the point of your lower intervention point, or getting close to it. Now, the unfortunate thing is that there are mechanisms by which you can push those values up, unfortunately. So we know that if you gain a lot of adipose tissue quickly, you actually grow more fat cells. And we also know that, like I mentioned earlier, I planted a seed, that individuals with common obesity actually have very high leptin levels. So the question is, well, what's going on? Why isn't that working? Why isn't that resulting in the cascade that drives their weight down? And I described how, we're not well adapted to defend that upper intervention point. That's a very general statement. What does that actually mean? What it actually means is that when we look at leptin physiology, we see that you actually get leptin resistance at a very high level. When you're in the chronic presence of very high levels of leptin, just like when you're in the chronic presence of very high levels of insulin, you can get the equivalent of like insulin resistance. You can get leptin resistance. Now, leptin is not actually doing its job, so it becomes this kind of negative feedback loop, and it starts to run away. And you hear stories of people with obesity who are still hungry. They don't feel satiated after meals. They are essentially experiencing metabolic dysregulation. And so it is this unfortunate scenario where humans are just not as good at defending that upper point, and the mechanisms we have in place are insufficient to counter the environmental pressures that we get, at least at the upper intervention point. And hanging out there for a very long time, and having obesity as a child, having parents who have obesity, eating in a large calorie surplus, having a low level of activity, which we've talked about, all those compounding effects can mean that someone might have a lower intervention point that is unfortunately quite high, and might even be in a position where we would consider normal, or even slightly higher in body fat than that person might desire. So it can be very challenging for some people to maintain normal weight from a physiological perspective. And that's on top of all the stuff that we had Ben House and Gabriel Fendero on to talk about of the modern environment. And I think the modern environment should not be underestimated, because there are some data that I think are really interesting that show that if you significantly modify the environment that you're in, you can hang out around your lower intervention point. So I think in some ways up to this point, I've told a very fatalistic story that kind of just sounds like it sucks. The situation can get worse physiologically from our environment. And, some people, their lower intervention point is them being overweight, and where they're currently hanging out is with obesity, and there's no hope. But if we acknowledge that the environment plays such a strong role, and that this huge unregulated zone where environment is a dominant factor, that implies that with environmental regulation, change, behavior modification, you could hang out at your lower intervention point. And it's actually really interesting when you start to look at people in very different environments. So there was a study that I came across back actually when I was at the retreat that Ben House put on in Costa Rica. One of my fellow attendees, Dean, did a presentation about activity and body fat and having a high flux state. And he showed us some data from a study on a Amish community, actually in Ontario, back in, I think, the mid-2000s. And the body fat percentage, and I think this is important because, we could look at like hunter-gatherer societies, but I think if we want to look at something that's reasonable, we need to look at something that is post-agricultural but more pre-industrial. And as we talked about, even in 1950s, definitely describing, a post-industrial society, we did not have an obesity epidemic. So we don't have to go that far removed from modern society to look at a time when people were walking around with a lower average population level body fat, right? And you and I have talked about, old movies from like the 30s in Germany where like people are just walking around with abs, right? And I think we don't want to forget that, because that's the other side of the coin, is that the normal state is not the one we're living in for the human condition. So get this. So what they took about 100 people in this Amish society, men and women, and they gave them pedometers, and they also got them to step on a BIA scale. Okay. So this isn't fantastic. Like they didn't give them, they didn't do doubly labeled water, and they didn't get them to sit down through a DEXA or lay down through a DEXA with just their underwear. But come on, what are you going to expect from a society that rejects some of the comforts of modern life and is a traditionalist, a separatist, conservative Christian society? I think it's awesome that they're willing to do even just this. So this isn't highly valid data, but I think it is, because there's about 100 people. I think it's pretty representative. And the step counts in the men, who were largely and predominantly farmers, I think close to about 80% of them, was around 18,000 on average. That's a lot of daily steps. That's just the average, right? And their body fat percentage was, I think, 9.4% on average.
Yeah, crazy.
Like I said, this is bioimpedant. It's not DEXA, but nonetheless, I think it's probably a reasonable proxy for their average. Interestingly enough, the women were not the same equivalent level of lean. For one, they were not farmers. They were predominantly homemakers, about 70% of them, but they still were very active. They had about 14,000 steps. And I don't think people should take away from that, once you get from 14 to 18,000 steps, you're going to be able to hang out at your lower intervention point. That's not it. There are other environmental factors at play. For example, just one of them is that the Amish women, on average, Omar, have 7 children.
Just on average.
Yeah, on average. So that alone means that they're probably going to be carrying more body fat than you'd expect. obviously with pregnancy and even the period after pregnancy and how far along are they spaced, that alone could explain why they were I think around like 25% body fat, which is not high in body fat, by the way. That's still a very healthy, normal body fat. It's not the female equivalent of 9%, which would be like, 17, 18%. But it is understandable given the different roles of the sexes in Amish society. So, another thing you could say when you look at this is, well, how do we know the Amish men weren't experiencing REDs? Like, how do we know they were good to go? Well, they weren't trying to be lean. I think that's an important thing here. It's not like the Amish value, like shredded abs. That's not a thing there. And they were eating a lot. So there was a dissertation I came across which profiled diets in a largely agricultural farming Amish society, and I think the men were eating like 3,600 calories on average. So, like I said, this is a post-agricultural society, and they eat breads, they eat cakes, they use full fat, butter. It's a farming community. They have plenty of food. They have to make all their own food, so it's not ultra processed food. It's not hyper palatable, and they can't just order Uber and get it to show up at their door. They have to spend all day in the fields and milking their animals and doing all this stuff to get it. So even just removing a couple of the facets which we think contribute to the obesity epidemic, like very low activity, hyperpalatable foods, and ultra processing, but still keeping plenty of processing, and still keeping a high calorie, high sugar, high fat diet in place, and we see a complete change in the walk around body fat percentage in both men and women. It's more pronounced in men, where they were probably hanging out around that lower intervention point on average. So I think that's really encouraging. That tells you that if you do things like stay active, eat largely whole foods, really active. I'm not expecting everyone to go like, all right, 18,000 steps a day, but it just goes to show you that you don't have to get that far from the modern society to start seeing a return to what we might be expected at and hanging around rather than close to our upper intervention point as a population on average, closer to our lower intervention point. So that's kind of the counter argument. I think there's a big difference between, 9% body fat and 5% body fat in men, importantly. But I think it goes to show you that you probably could modify your environment and hang out around your lower intervention point, but you do need to respect that you do have a lower intervention point. And it is not just the industry standard 8, 10, or 12% that people say. It is whatever it is. And you identify it as the point that gives you that pushback. And, like if you've struggled 15 times to hang around, 8, 10, 12, or 15% body fat, which, by the way, you are none of those. You just think you look like that and you're probably something different. Then that's probably below that point, or you don't have the ability to manipulate your environment to the degree where you can hang around there. And to some degree, you do have to maybe respect that more. I can't tell you how many times people just keep making the thing worse and developing more disordered eating patterns and a worse body image, and just basically not enjoying life because they don't respect it. And I get that a big part of that is because the industry tells you that you can get it. You just have to do the right thing. Buy my book, buy my supplement, try this, try that, But I think it's really interesting. That data on the Amish is the closest thing to a counterpoint to me pointing out that it is very challenging to stay lean. I think it is very challenging to stay shredded, but there is the theoretical possibility with sufficient environmental manipulation to stay close to your lower intervention point, wherever that might be. And that's the most simplified but still nuanced way of describing what is preventing people from being shredded or how shredded could they stay.
Eric, let me just say, how dare you?
You may. I dare.
How dare you? Because Eric knows my forever move is still underway. So unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to peruse the article. And if your communist tendencies to, have me develop some sort of sympathy for those that struggle with obesity and understand that, hey, everyone has their own journey, and that old and now probably archaic notion that when you start off at a higher body fat level, it's definitely easier for someone at a higher body fat level than it is a lower body fat level. If you're going to challenge one of the fundamental notions of judgment within the fitness community, which is that the shreddy shreds have it the toughest and everyone else just doesn't want it bad enough, how dare you, first? Because I wasn't expecting that. I thought we both agreed. You said, hey, Omar, I want to talk about how to, not the dangers of getting shredded, but some of the consequences, or why is it potentially difficult. difficult to navigate that path while it's perilous. I said, cool. And then he just hits me with that out of nowhere. And then I have my second regressive tendency, which is this one right here, Eric, that I couldn't help but wonder as you're laying the beat down, you're talking about energy availability, and you're talking about the different methods of approaching a level of leanness. God, am I the toxic one here? Because I was thinking about not gamifying the system, but understanding that, okay, if these are the parameters and you gave a few different scenarios, and this is my question, man, because I do want to go back to that. You ended on environment. I want to go back just very briefly about entering into that where it's a dual intervention, where you're entering to that leaner phase where you gave two different scenarios. One, where you're talking about someone, if you go 8 to 12 weeks, so you try and lose 20 pounds or whatever, like old bodybuilding preps, where inevitably your energy availability is going to be very low. Reds, it's going to happen. You're going to start feeling terrible more rapidly. Okay, granted, I follow 3DMJ on the other hand, and I'm wondering now that it's inevitable. So I'm not trying to circumvent the issue that is inevitable. Once again, let me just say period. But is this a fair statement to say, Eric, that there are different methods of approaching getting leaner, that some would accelerate the process of low energy availability, reds forming, and then the unintended consequences thereof? Would you say that's accurate? That there's certain ways, like you just mentioned, like the crash diet, that there are certain ways of trying to pursue leanness that would just compound it into a way that would be untenable? Is that kind of accurate? Before I go on.
Absolutely. And you can see this in the response you get from a traditional bodybuilder when I suggest that they follow a longer contest prep diet, because they think of the experience of getting shredded in 12 weeks and then just doubling it, and it's double the pain, right? Rather than thinking of it, there's a disproportionate decrease in the amount of struggle that I have per week. So 24 weeks actually ends up being easier than 12 weeks. But I will say that you can take that too far. Like as you mentioned, you're essentially circling the drain. There is a point where you're going to get lean enough to where you're going to have unavoidable, negative effects from this constant circulating low leptin from having a low body fat level relative to your own lower intervention point. That then if you spend another 12 weeks at that point, it doesn't matter what you eat. You're going to start to feel like crap. And I know you were going to ask a question, but just real quick, I actually had the experience in 2019 personally, to give a personal anecdote here, of doing both a reverse diet and a recovery diet. So I got lean in the end of May. And then you saw me compete in my first show in July. So that means I'd already gone through June. And then I competed in the end of July. And then I competed in the middle of August. So I think I had 10 weeks of eating up from my very, very lowest digging point, highest deficit, pushing hard to get shredded, average intake of 1,600 calories a day, to then walking up to where I was walking around on a day-to-day basis on 25 to 2,800 calories a day for a month. And even prior to that, it was still higher than 1,600. Like I jumped from 16 to like 19, and then I was going up 100 calories a week, and I just plateaued and hung out at 25 to 2,800 calories. And don't get me wrong, like I felt better in June and early July by far than I did in May. But I just never got back up to 100%. I always felt like my tank was half empty, and it didn't matter how much I ate. And it wasn't until after my show where I spent September and October and most of November just gaining weight. And I got up to, I think it's when I got up to like 90 kilos, which is about 8 weeks post-diet. So I gained 10 kilograms, 22 pounds over my stage weight, that I start to feel like 80, 90% of normal. Mm-hmm. And then by November, I was like pretty much 100% good to go. So you can alleviate some of the effects by eating more. Because like I said, there are acute boosts in leptin that you get from eating. But then, I'm done digesting and I feel like shit again, and it's not like I felt those immediate lulls between meals, but it's just like you're like the battery life is not only on half, but the possible battery life you can have is also on half. Even when you fill it up, you still feel like you're at half life. So yeah, I think that is the anecdote matches the model in that case. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, go ahead and ask the question you're going to ask.
No, Eric, there's so many. I do think this is probably where the role of the coach guiding the athlete would be paramount, because there are so many variables that would have the largest of impacts. One would be, so as you said, for yourself, it's like trying to find out with this intervention model, like what that sticking point is where things just start really feeling grimy, how long someone's staying at that point, what did you do to get to that point? And then the other thing would be I assume, like trying to quantify all these, Eric, like your response to getting to that point where I assume everyone would have responded the exact same. So let's say you get down, so you actually like you're shredded, right? And then for you to eat up, like I assume there's a range, once again, like a mathematical range of how much body fat you need to regain until you'll start feeling normal. But that in and of itself, like all these things are experiences one must go through, where I'm just giving like a shitty example here. But in your case, let's say it's like you said you gained 10 kgs, you've done this several times, you start feeling 80 to 90%. But then we hear these stories, and this isn't like, this isn't an accurate representation, but you get down, you do the show. Maybe once again your energy availability was so much lower that as a consequence that rebound was much higher. My question for you would be that this whole terrible experience of the shreddy shreds, I assume over time that you managed to navigate all those important variables so that it's a little bit easier to get into that zone. It's a little bit easier to stay in that zone. And it's a little bit easier to resume back to whatever standard you were before so that there's not unintended consequences down the road. Like to what you said, Eric, like, oh, you gained 10 kilograms back. I feel 80%. And that 80% doesn't linger, bro, for then like a year. Like you basically started at whatever point, got lean, and whew, you gained your weight back now. And you basically, you're back to your starting weight, but you don't feel the same. So I assume like there's a lot of nuance in this journey that would be hard to like directly quantify. Like, hey guys, so it's like 10%, and then you want to make sure you do this, and this would be a rough approximation. Like that's where coaching would really, if one wanted to ever endeavor to do this, is invaluable.
Absolutely. It is very challenging to quantify these things because they're highly individually dependent. At best, what I can do is point out where there is individual variation in the model that I've kind of constructed here. And I think it's really important, and it explains why we see people with a wide variety of responses to dieting, different points at which it's challenging, different walk-around off-season body fat percentages, and different diet lengths and success rates, how lean they got, and how much they regain weight. So there is individual variability in where your lower intervention point is. So some people have a very low lower intervention point, like Alberto Nunez, Some people have a higher one. Some people have a pretty high one, So there's individual variation there. There is also individual variation as to where your energy availability threshold is. Like I said in the research, some athletes with higher energy output and maybe just the way they're built, they can experience symptoms of low energy availability at 40 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass, and others might not hit it until they're at 25, right? And then there's also individual variability in the degree to which you experience adaptive thermogenesis, whether you're spendthrift or thrifty, as they would describe it in some of the metabolic adaptation research or adaptive thermogenesis. And then there's and then there's on top of that, which is semi-modifiable, which is what you're getting at with coaching and time, is how do you respond to that, And like, for example, when we had Ben House on, he was talking about the differences between like self-guided attempts at weight loss maintenance long-term, very high failure rates, 90% of people regain their weight. However, when you look at like the best methods we have guided for, a period of time after the intervention, like acceptance-based therapy, frequent contact, you start to get around the point where like 40 to 50% of people can maintain at least 5% of their weight loss for years, right? And yeah, I think there are elements of that with coaching. And to show you my own progression, so in 2007, absolute shit show. I put on, 48 pounds, nearly 50 pounds in 2 months post-show. I had uncontrolled binge eating. I was concerned. I was not expecting it. I figured, being a skinny dude who got into lifting, I would be back to normal within weeks is what I thought. And I didn't even have a concept of that challenging transitional period. And I figured, I'm really, really hungry because I've been dieting, but give me a couple days and I'll be back to like normal satiety responses. No, I didn't feel satiety until July after my show in May. Like, what is this thing of feeling full in response to meals? And boom, and you damn near gained 50 pounds in 2 months. 2009, I got even leaner than I did in 2007. In 2007, I was tapping out after 5 or 6 months of dieting at getting to reasonably lean condition. No one would have said I was like out of shape, but they said I could have got leaner in 2007. 2009, I got shredded for the first time, but I pushed myself for like 38 weeks to do it. Absolutely crushed myself. And I was having a lot of pushback from my body, big time mental stuff. And I only gained like 30 pounds, but it was in twice the time period. But I was definitely feeling worse for longer. It was just that I had more control because I anticipated what was coming. And I had, because I took a more, a more appropriate approach in '09, a little more evidence-based, I knew how hard it was going to be. I had the ability to push myself. I didn't tap out as early. 2011 was the first time I had what I would describe as a comparatively easy prep. It surprised me. I didn't have much of an issue. I actually tried to stay too lean for too long. I did a reverse diet back in 2011, and I was hanging around like 190 pounds, which is like 87 kilos or something like that. And I was experiencing like this low grade suppression of feeling normal for a while. And I could tell that it wasn't related to time. It wasn't related to how much food I was eating, but I couldn't eat anymore unless I gained body fat. So it was like, whether it was body fat or eating, like if I ate more, I would gain body fat and then I would feel better. So it became obvious to me that there was a link between what's the low end body fat level I could hang out and what was the amount of food that I needed to feel normal. And I couldn't stay at probably hanging around 10 or 11% body fat all the time. But I was able to manipulate my environment and my mindset to do so, but it didn't benefit me, right? I just kind of spun my wheels in the off season for a while. And then 2019 was where I had the easiest prep, but I got the leanest I'd ever been. And like I said, put on 22 pounds quick. So it was kind of like less than I gained in '09, more than I gained in 2011, but I felt better the fastest. So there's definitely been a progression and a recalibration, and I figured that out for myself. But it has taken me, like being involved in the sport and having my own body go through multiple preps to get there. So yeah, there's like I said, individual variation at multiple points in these interconnected models, and there is a lot of modifiable factors within environment. I consider psychology and behavior. That's part of that, right? So for me, absolutely, and with the guidance of a coach, Alberto, and also my colleagues at 3DMJ and my own studies and thoughts and personal awareness and reflections, I've been able to figure out what works best, or what has worked best up to this point for myself. But yeah, it's taken time for sure.
Eric, I'm a terrible human because you've clearly outlined over the last 45 minutes the dangers and the perils of, once again, either getting shredded or attempting to remain shredded, and why it is you don't see individuals staying shredded. And the only questions I basically have for you, like, no, that's cool, Eric, but if one was to approach this, like, what would be the best approach? Like, it's the most regressive fitness take on anything. And like, even like you bringing up, like, I mean that genuinely, but I did not know those, once again, that carry a higher body fat level, about like leptin levels and all those sorts of things. Because like, full disclosure, as someone who's interested in getting yakety yacked and all those things, that's not like the purview of my interest. And as soon as I was like, I was like, shit, Eric, that's interesting. What a bad take on my end, let me just say, after everything you overviewed. I'm like, okay, but if we're going to do this.
Well, let's be honest. Like, for people interested in this, like, figuring out how lean they can stay and still be able to perform, that's a really common, and it's a reasonable athletic goal. Like, So for example, some of the pushback I've got against the idea that body fat matters and there is such a thing as being too lean, but that it's individual for people, is noticing that there are certain classes of athlete who do this all the time. Like, they're shredded. Like, I 100% concede that at a certain level, if you look at sprinters, fighters, most of them are what we would describe, like, most of them are acceptable stage condition. Like in certain elite levels, that's as common as it is for people to be a little bit higher in body fat, or at least for large portions of the season that we would consider like way too long for bodybuilding. And I think you have to be able to explain that. And it is not only that it's selection bias, right? I think that is too high of a logical hurdle to go over. And I think it's important to remember that athletes like to win, right? So they have a very strong motivating factor. They're willing to have some symptoms of REDS to some degree, to the degree that it doesn't impede their performance. They're looking for the net quote unquote win. Like, if I'm a little bit food focused, a little bit hungry, and a little bit lethargic, but not to the point where it's impeding my training, and I can walk around at 10% body fat, and I can run a 9.9 versus a 10.0, I might make the Olympic trials. And I'm okay with that because I'm a world-class sprinter. That's everything that I am right now. This is what I'm doing with this phase of my life, right? If I can make the featherweight class and dominate it, I'm okay with having some disordered eating patterns and having these really hardcore cuts because I'm the UFC champ. you know? Like, so that's a thing.
Yeah.
Likewise, just like athletes like to win, Omar, influencers like your likes and they like your money.
Yes.
So not every single one of the people who has their shirt off and has shredded abs while they promote some random watch or, you know, some greens shake that they just changed from last week and trying to get you to buy it, and they're telling you how amazing it is, has a low body fat intervention point. It's probably low enough, but some of them are certainly okay with being, you know, a little redsy. You know, they have some mild to moderate symptoms of reds, and they're happy to live their life with that because they have a strong motivator to do that. That's the way humans work, right? That, I mean, we have to acknowledge that. And I think some people are okay for at least a certain period of time living in a slightly less than optimal state because something else makes it worth it, you know? So just don't assume that everyone you do see who is competing at a high level or who is, you know, shilling with their shirt off is necessarily, shirt off shilling, folks. That's a good Rascal apparel. Is necessarily like not feeling it, but they're definitely presenting. They're accepting where they're at, and that is something that's someone's choice. You know, I'm okay with, you know, wherever you're at with that. I think I've been largely addressing, you know, where can you get to with feeling normal, you know, and just modifying your environment and not crossing that lower intervention point. And for, I think, a lot of people, unfortunately, because of the signaling they get for what is sexy or hot or normal or good in the fitness industry, that is going to be the lower intervention point. For some people, it won't. And for some people, it'll just be a little bit below it. And that's why you get those disparate experiences. And I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think the answer to, you know, how do I stay as lean as possible without having a negative effect on me is going to be sexy. You know, we talked, like, I'm not going to pitch you the Amish diet, you know, but what have they done? They're highly active and they removed ultra palatable and highly processed foods. Like that's not a new message. Eat more fruits and vegetables, eat a reasonably high protein diet, lift weights, be active, don't be sedentary, and control your environment so that you're not being inundated with things that make you want to eat a lot, you know. Try to remove foods that come with, you can't just eat one as a caveat, you know. So yeah, it's nothing new, but I think a lot of the stock standard things of be active enough that satiety is regulated and you have a high energy output, you know, have a high flux state, you know, live a fitness-based lifestyle. That's not something that most people can do, but the people who can do it are those who are interested in doing it, but they already know those things, you know? So it's just don't get sucked into one of the, it's got to be a ketogenic diet, or you need to fast for the first 16 hours of the day or whatever, because, you know, the Amish are on neither one of those diets. You know, they're definitely eating big breakfast. You know what I'm saying? And they get up pretty early and they eat before they go to work. So I think the staples are what are going to get you there. And I know this wasn't part of your question, Omar, but Dave, basically the answer is everything else we've talked about in the other 175 episodes besides our you know, animal combat episodes, which are the best. And that's how you do it, right? Yeah. However, I do think one thing is worth considering is that hanging out at your lower intervention point, might not also be the best place to put on muscle mass, right? I think that should be acknowledged, that going into a surplus, there's going to be inevitable fat gain just due to the slow rates of muscle gain you can attain and our inability to have precision around knowledge of how much fat we're gaining, how much muscle we're gaining, etc. So like if you are just want to focus on strength and improving your movement patterns while hanging around maintenance, awesome. You know, if that's cool with the person, if they're happy with their current level of physique, you know. But I think a lot of people also want to put on more muscle. They have a very progressive mindset, and that's why the question of how lean can I stay is a bodybuilding adjacent question, but it's not one asked by bodybuilders. Bodybuilders are much more concerned with cool. I'll get the pictures when I am lean, but how do I put on more muscle? How do I keep improving? We're in the cult of progressive overload, folks. I've literally got the shit tattooed on my chest. So I think to some degree, I'm happy to answer the question, but I will also put forth, should that be the question, you know, depending on what your goals are. And I think a lot of people get that push and pull. I experience it myself when I diet down. Like, I got this, you know, one person on my shoulder saying I need to make progress. Like the feedback I got from the judges were, you're shredded, but bigger guys beat you. At every show I didn't place first in, right? And on the other shoulder, it's like, yeah, but I really like walking around looking shredded. Like people, like I got more followers. People think I'm awesome. This is, like people ask me questions like, hey man, like all the reasons why people want to be lean. I'm also human. I am to some degree affected by those things as well. So I think it's really important to have a strong why, because you don't want to find yourself wrapped into a very challenging, physiologically and psychologically demanding goal that wasn't even your own creation, but it's something that you got wrapped up in because of the pressure of social media, because then you won't even be able to sustain it. And then you're just going to feel like a failure. And it's just going to be like the steady erosion of the waves on the rocks of your self-efficacy, and you don't want none of that smoke.
Oh my God. No, Eric, I do want to go back to one of my favorite images, which is you trapped in a room being fed food in order to maintain a ridiculously lean level of body fat. And I want to talk about, just very briefly, to your point, the secret narratives that go on for some of these individuals that are seemingly at these very lean body fat levels, and they're enjoying their life, and on the outside everything seems fine. I can't help but wonder for a small portion of them, because you're right about the self-selection process, that those that have that a lower point will probably hang out there, and those are the ones that we see. At the same time, I could speak in three different scenarios, because these are the ones that people will bring up. One, when they talk about movie stars, movie stars have huge incentives. You think they're all on steroids? Yeah, maybe some of them are on steroids, but if you were given $10 million to get shredded, you'd get shredded too. I'm like, maybe, because your external motivation is at all-time high, but the long-term unintended consequences, I brought up that guy who was in the Eternals, Kumail, where he was on, I'm forgetting honestly if it's like Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, really doesn't matter, but when we talk about reds and like clear signs, Eric, of like low energy availability and I'm not talking food focus. I'm talking, I could only imagine, bro, because I haven't been at that point. But like whatever happens when you get shredded and that extreme food focus, like he was salivating on air. And keep in mind, this is a grown ass human who has to maintain his composure, and he's like seen as a celebrity and he's like a big figure. At the prospect of being allowed, because he's pressured into doing it, when the food dropped from the stage because he got super lean at that point. So that's one. Like we talk about like, okay, they achieve these levels, but is this healthy? Clearly not. One. Two, I could say for the fitness space, you're absolutely correct that I think the extra motivation allows you to live with some of the symptoms of reds and be like, well, it's worth, like the juice is worth the squeeze. Like I got all these followers and so forth, but I have it on good authority.
What's that quote, Omar? Nothing tastes as good as being lean feels.
yeah. One of the things.
The quote that you have a problem if you've nodded to that and be like, amen. Like, no. It's weird that you're thinking of that, because that means you are constantly fighting your hunger. And is being lean really that awesome, or do you need to have a little more meaning in your life?
I mean, those are the two deep questions, bro. I'm just talking, like they're just talking about getting that yakety. Yeah. But you do provoke the far more interesting ones. I've on good authority, man, that at least two people, one person that's known for being like decently lean, like year round, or they do a lot of preps. This person hates their life in terms, like their relationship with food is actually terrible. And it's one of those, and they do talk a little bit about it, but it's actually far worse off camera than they're even letting on. So like just when you see, you know what, Eric, someone opens up in quotations on camera, like, oh man, that's a real one. Like he's so real when he does that. I'm like, you actually don't know like how bad it is. Like you think this is what they're admitting is the level of discomfort they've experienced when it comes to their relationship with their food. But this is something I could only assume, Eric, if they ever go retire, that their relation, it's going to explode. And the last thing I want to bring up to that point would be, we bring up athletes, man, because again, I've been watching a lot of MMA and UFC. There's three fighters I'm just going to list right now that come to my mind that are fighters known for being like, in shape. They're not crazy lean, but they're part of that category. To your point, Eric, you see them, they weigh in, it's like, dude, you're clearly lean. Three of them. One, Cowboy Cerrone, a guy who just retired recently. The first thing he said is that take a good look. He's a 155er at this body, because I plan on getting fat, because he's been stage conditioned basically for 10 years. He said that. Paddy Pimblett, Paddy the Baddy, a new UFC fighter. He's now legendary for, he's a legend for this, Eric. He competes at 155. He's gained post-fight 2 times now inside of a year. This isn't like, can we say terrible content? 40 pounds post-fight, and then he diets down again in 16-week prep. These are two examples of fighters. I could literally list 5, 6 more that have the exact same stories that like they make funny Instagram posts, but like, man, I'm thinking about the long-term consequences of them dieting down to that point and cycling back,
And there's a ton of research on this. There's a qualitative interview with a bunch of female collegiate athletes who had to, quote unquote, and they describe this in the theme. This is from their interviews. This isn't the researchers putting words in their mouth. Learn to eat normally again once they retired from their sport, And this goes back to my point where, like, yes, you're going to see more athletes in sports where they're benefited from being lean, who are naturally lean, but you're going to see just as many, if not more, who can be lean and can compete at a high level, but they're not naturally lean, and they're either going to suffer the consequences now or later or both to some degree. It's just not. There is a cost to what they're doing, is all I'm saying, which isn't anything controversial. I'm not saying they shouldn't be doing it or that it's not worth it for them, but they're experiencing some degrees. Like, that's why they're regaining 40 pounds, right? So that's the whole reason why there's a higher prevalence of REDs in sports where you're benefited from being leaner. So the selection thing doesn't take care of the quote unquote problem, Ironically, you actually made me think of a paper that I reviewed in Mass back in like the first or second issue, or rather the first or second volume. And it's Prevalence of Indicators of Low Energy Availability in Elite Female Sprinters by Saigo and colleagues. And this is what I thought was really trippy. So they looked at the amount of RED symptoms that these people were experiencing, and they looked at how it changed over a sprinting season. And interestingly enough, the people with more symptoms of REDs were slightly higher in body fat. But this is a lean cohort of women. Their average body fat percentage was 20%. So they're lean. So the way I tentatively, speculatively interpreted this was that there's some women who can hang out around 20% on average with very few symptoms of REDs. Those are your more natural sprinters. And then there's the women who can have some mild to moderate symptoms of REDs, but they have to diet to get there, and they're still not even as lean. So like, they're working hard to stay competitive. And I think that's an example of some of those fighters you brought up. Like, there are probably some fighters who are pretty lean, always have been lean. Yeah, they cut weight, but it's normally water manipulation. They go out for Chinese food afterwards. They get it off their mind, and the next week they're just training again, not thinking about it. Those are out there, but there's just as many who are, as soon as there's no more championship belt, it's Taco Tuesday on a Monday. So I think, it's definitely a mixed bag. And the converse of that is true as well. Like, there's a lot of people who, the counter argument to what I've said thus far is, hey, I knew someone who was 100 pounds overweight, lost it all, and now they walk around shredded. Like, again, we really can't forget how large of a role the environment plays. Again, the average body fat in this cohort of Amish men was 9.4%. If you took all of those people and you looked at their grandkids after they, let's say, left the Amish community, been living just in, I don't know, Ohio for the last, the next 3 generations, some of those people with the genetics to walk around at 9% body fat or leaner, there was a standard deviation on that body fat percentage, right? Would be with obesity, right? So you can have somebody, in fact, I even heard a story of this. There's a woman who got really, really out of shape, and she worked with this trainer. She used to be an Olympic boxer, and now she walks around shredded all the time. And that was kind of a counter argument to what I'm saying. And I'm like, so hold on. So yes, she has a before picture of being very high in body fat, and now she has an after picture of walking around shredded, but she used to be an Olympian. Like, yeah, environment is very strong. It can take someone who has a very low intervention point, who is naturally very lean, and it can overcome all of that because of the world we live in. That's why there's an obesity epidemic. So you can have people who are walking around lean, who are not, quote unquote, meant to be lean naturally, and you can have the inverse. People who are meant to be lean, who are walking around not lean, based upon the effects of the environment, which again encompasses pretty much everything besides the physiology. So yeah, and I think one more thing. Just I know I'm like debating this person who doesn't exist, who's not really even debating with me. I'm just making sure that this, I can't help but do it. I'm built to disconfirm hypotheses. I'm a researcher. I want to make sure that I can't figure out how I could be wrong before I state that I'm confidently, maybe, possibly close to something approximating right. So like, in this article, the very last section on Stronger by Science was basically me, okay, I've constructed this model. Maybe it's a house of cards. Let me blow on it and see if the house of cards collapses. And if not, maybe I'm close to something right. So me kind of putting the test to this model was looking at some other research. And if we bought into the idea that body fat actually didn't matter, that it was just energy availability, and then anyone could walk around shredded if they just did it right, had the right mindset, had the right tools, whatever, worst fitness narrative possible, bootstraps, let's do it, then we would expect a couple of things. For one, we would expect a deficit to impact people the same way, regardless of their body fat, right? So you diet a person with obesity, you diet a lean person, same physiological effects. That would be required if this was the counterfactual that body fat doesn't matter. But actually, there was a recent meta-analysis that came out that showed that individuals, males specifically, with obesity, they saw an increase in testosterone while dieting, while those who were leaner saw the opposite, a decrease, right? So that right there gives the exact opposite of that. And that's a meta-analysis by Smith and colleagues that came out just this year, back in April, examining the effects of calorie restriction on testosterone concentrations in men, a systematic review and meta-analysis. We would also expect similar amounts of lean body mass losses for the same deficit size, right? And that's not what we see. That's something that's, I think, pretty well established. We see pretty different adaptations to dieting. When we look at people who are not normal weight, they're with overweight or obesity, and they go on a calorie deficit, we see blunted muscle protein synthesis. We look at the similar occurrence in people who are lean. We see elevated muscle protein breakdown and elevated synthesis. When we put individuals with obesity on a starvation diet or people who are very lean, the lean individuals are using 2 to 3-fold as much energy from protein. Leucine oxidation, way higher, much higher rates of gluconeogenesis. And we also see greater lean body mass losses in leaner cohorts compared to those with higher adiposity. Not uncommon at all for you take a population with obesity, you have them do resistance training, you put them in a large calorie deficit, they put on muscle while losing body fat, right? We've talked about body recomposition and how the higher your body fat level, the easier it is when we had Christopher Barakat on, right? So not only do we see divergent effects when people go on deficits at different body fat percentages, we also have the closest thing to direct research on this. It's observational in nature, but I think it's really telling. So now we're not just dealing with the N of 1 Eric Helms experiences to back this up. There was actually a case series on bodybuilding competitors, or I should say physique sport competitors, done by Longstrom and colleagues that came out of Dr. Bill Campbell's lab. I got the unique opportunity to consult with James Longstrom before he did this. The original goal was to compare recovery dieting to reverse dieting after shows. Didn't get a large enough N, and also among the people who actually did do the study, they had a really tough time adhering to a specific post-show pattern. So it became a case series instead of a parallel group design. So there was 3 men and 4 women who were able to complete the study. So very challenging to get true bodybuilding competitors, and even more challenging to get those who are willing to follow a protocol and then stick to it. Really hard stuff. But nonetheless, 1 to 2 weeks before the show, they measured body composition and then resting metabolic rate, thyroid hormone, and leptin levels. And they did it again 8 to 10 weeks post-show, just to look at the relationships. And there were a number of people who successfully followed a quote-unquote reverse diet, which basically meant trying to stay lean while slowly increasing calories, right? So for example, there were 2 men who 8 to 10 weeks post-show had only gone up 2% body fat. So they were still under 10% body fat. And there was either a no change or, if I recall correctly, a very slight change in resting metabolic rate. And there's either no change or a drop in leptin. And then there was one woman who 8 to 10 weeks post-show, she got her body fat percentage up to the level of leanness of which the other 3 women competed at. So she was really lean in competition and was still very lean, only gaining, I think, 2.7% body fat over those 8 to 10 weeks post-show at 15% body fat. And she had the lowest leptin levels among all of the competitors, of the women, excuse me. And I believe there was either a slight drop or no changing in her resting metabolic rate. And at the group level, when you looked at relationships, we saw that there was a 0.9 correlation between change in body fat percentage with the change in resting metabolic rate, and I think a 0.88 correlation between the change in body fat percentage and the change in leptin. So these are people who everyone ate more, everybody gained some weight, but you saw that there was a clear and very strong relationship between body fat percentage and metabolic recovery. So when you like that's me blowing on this model, me going, okay, is this a house of cards? Is it going to collapse? And it doesn't look like it. When we look at people getting lean and trying to stay lean, doesn't matter if they're eating more, doesn't matter if they gained a little bit of body fat, they're still suffering the majority of the consequences which you expect them being in a dieted state, despite the fact they're either at maintenance or a slight surplus. Likewise, you take lean people, you take people with obesity, you diet them, differential effects. So at this stage, I think the integration between the dual intervention model, the low energy availability REDS model, and our understanding of metabolic adaptation, as I've tried to present in this article, is something that's at least approximating the truth for people trying to get leaner. I don't think it holds up very well, and this is a notable limitation for people who are approaching the upper intervention point or people with obesity because of those more complicated metabolic effects related to leptin resistance and changes in where your intervention points are from having obesity and gaining more fat cells for a long period of time. And that's frankly beyond my expertise. And there's more complex physiology there. That's why there's so much investment and time and energy put into studying obesity and having a better understanding of it. But at least when we're talking about what is preventing people from being really lean all the time and why can some people do it and others can't, I think we have a pretty cohesive kind of idea of why that is if we connect the dots.
Eric, what you're saying, there's no house of cards here. There's no Kevin Spacey. No one's ass is going to prison because his ass should go to prison. I will say, honestly, Eric, I think you did an extremely thorough job. I'm not even being funny here, of the overview, the logical train of thought to arrive where we are, and that's why at the end, like I was joking, but also like kind of serious with my questioning in terms of okay, you're getting down, like what can one do? I think maybe my only comment to say in closing about all this is that we talk often about informed consent. And I think this is a brilliant episode in the sense that how many individuals listening to this have gone shredded? I don't know. But now it's like understanding like why. It's like, because that is a good question, right? It's not a naive question, I think, for someone to ask. Like, okay, like if you can get lean and like, let's say you use the best models or best practices, like even still, like it really is hard to stay lean. Like, why is that the case? Oh, that is the case. And that is probably why. And that's why it's inevitable. It's going to have, it's not like a potential scenario. It's like there is a theoretical point that is going to happen. The only thing I wish when we talk about informed consent, more as it relates to like maybe those TikTokers, those Instagram people and whatnot, is that there's like a, how do you say, there's like an asymmetry, there's an opacity of experience that one must go through before you can understand how bad it would be. And like to your point, that's why I say, Eric, like full disclosure, bro, I've never gotten like shredded. I don't know what it feels like. That for these, even the people basically, once they have the mechanisms, like the marketing mechanisms that allow them to ignore more or less like some of the symptoms of red, that would they choose the same course of action if they knew what the consequences would be over a long enough time course is the only thing that I wonder. That I find it an interesting question, because you could sign up and you could hear maybe even what you're saying. Like, let's say, bro, we could be birthing the next generation of TikTokers who are going to be shredded. They listen to it. They're like, okay, no, I understand. It's going to be like this. But until you go through it and until after you're done it and now you're dealing with the consequences, wow.
Yeah. And I think there's a difference between retrospectively looking at it and prospectively. Because we can't actually be told in advance, here's what you're going to experience. But afterwards, we're amazing at rationalizing all of our things and feeling no guilt or remorse or regret and thinking we did the right thing in all cases, which is impressive as humans, but maybe not close to the objective truth, if there is such a thing. But yeah, no, I agree. I think we did a good job on this one. I'm pretty pleased with it. And if anyone wants a much deeper dive, I think you can definitely check out the article on strongerbyscience.com. It's the most recent article as of the release of this podcast. Hopefully that doesn't change. But anyway, yeah, dude, I found I had a lot of fun with this one, kind of understanding the interconnection between different lines of research and that interacting with people's desires, and also how it connects to bodybuilding. But yeah, I do think this is not as intuitive as some people might think. Like I got one comment on Instagram that was, I think I'm paraphrasing, but I think it was, surely maintaining something is easier than achieving it in the first place, And I think like that's, if you frame it right, like, oh, I'm in a deficit and then I'm at maintenance. Maintenance is easier. But I think that kind of just shows like what you were saying, like, oh, they don't have that experience. Or maybe there's someone who's just naturally lean. But yeah, like, It is the exact opposite of that, because of the way human motivation typically works. That an indefinite goal without a distinct immediate purpose right now is really hard to motivate yourself to the same degree as I'm going to compete on July 5th at this show, So anyway, I think we're probably just repeating ourselves at this stage, but I hope it was an intriguing and informative episode for the listener.
Eric, you knocked that shit out of the park, man. And this is what I mean when I say capital T. So if you have, disconfirmation is just a part of your nature. So you're like, okay, let me blow on this house of cards. What's going on? And we were united with your libertarian tendencies against tyranny and my natural distrust for authority. The capital T that's occurring right now, I'm going to say this. I'm going to break the fourth wall. This is funny, man, because we've been recording this for 2 hours. My Xbox game recording whatever on this laptop, at the 2-hour mark, Eric, it just shut off. So shut off. But I'm recording audio, so it's fine. But my video, what I'm saying is my video cut off. They're really trying to stop us, bro. Like, if only people knew how good genuinely Eric is at being the Best Buy Geek Squad tech support for Iron, because like to get us to record video seamlessly and audio, it was all Eric being a MacGyver here, and they once again shut it off. Can you believe that, Eric? They shut it off, the video.
I can believe it because I explicitly told you how to modify the length of recording and when it auto shut off, and you disregarded it and did not change it from 2 hours. But to be fair, I also didn't think we'd go for 2 hours, but here we are, and you're welcome, dear listeners. But we should probably close it out now that no one can see your pretty face anymore.
Eric, let me just say thank you for everything. Those that are more interested, definitely check out the top link above the timestamp for mass monthly applications in strength sports. Exactly what Eric is talking about right here. You should already be signed up. Nonetheless, go ahead, leave a comment. We read them on YouTube. Go ahead, leave a rating and review on iTunes. We also tend to read those. We are back every single Monday. They try to stop us. They put on this pandemic. They sacrifice millions. Stalin said it. The death of one is a tragedy. The death of millions is a pandemic. And yet they couldn't stop us right now from carrying on with another scintillating episode of Iron Culture. So we'll see you every single Monday from now until the end of time. Until next time.